Welcome to the Point. Even as the lame duck legislature continues and many of those lawmakers prepare to leave Lansing, new members are coming in, including new leadership. This morning, we introduce you to the new Speaker of the House, Representative Lee Chatfield. First of all, let me start by congratulating you on being elected the Speaker-elect of the House. That's going to be a big change for you starting in January. Let's talk about that a little bit. What does it mean for you now to lead the majority in what is going to be divided government?
Well, the state of Michigan now for the first time will experience balanced power here in Lansing, something we haven't had in the past 8 years. And for me, it's an honor to have the confidence of my colleagues and those I serve with to be the next Speaker of the House. But what that means to me is building coalitions within the House and forgetting about partisan lines and ensuring that we're adopting policies that are in the best interest of the state of Michigan. And I look forward to working with the Senate and Governor-elect Whitmer and ensuring that we have the relationships that I believe are necessary to ensure we enact good, sound policy. And I'm optimistic about what we can accomplish in the coming years.
One of the things that has been the hallmark of the past 8 years that was very different than the previous 8 years, and for a number of reasons, is the budgeting process. The budgeting process has gotten done sooner and with a considerable ease that didn't exist before. And I always have to stop and say this. In the early years and the middle years, even towards the latter years of the Granholm administration, there were a lot of problems. One is you had Republicans and Democrats arguing, but the state also was woefully short of money. That has changed dramatically. So the budgeting process is naturally easier if you have enough money to meet priorities. But it will be different because the priorities of the new resident of the Romney building and your priorities are going to be different.
I think Michigan has led the country over the past 8 years in many regards. And under Governor Snyder's leadership, we've had sound budgeting processes that ultimately Republicans and Democrats have come together to ensure the budget is done on time and where ultimately businesses in the entire country know that Michigan is open for business. And what we've seen in our state, because of our sound budgeting practices, we've seen our economy grow. And that's not just good for Republicans and Democrats. That's good for every single person who lives here to ensure they can afford to live in our state, and it's a good place to live, work, raise a family, or even retire. And I think we should be proud of the fact that Michigan is leading the nation over the last 8 years in the growth of manufacturing jobs, and we have led the nation in paying down our long-term debt. I think it's unacceptable what we've been doing for decades in this state and even in our country on kicking the can down the road. And we've had sound budgeting practices over the last 8 years. It's not a partisan issue. I look forward to building a relationship with Governor-elect Whitmer to ensure that we continue that process in our state because it's incredibly important.
You talk about building coalitions, and I should point out that much of the legislation that is passed in either chamber is in a bipartisan way. We hear a lot about those that are not because those are the ones that make the headlines. But in those cases where you have to pull together 56 Republicans, you have fewer Republicans than you will for the remainder of this year. So how much more difficult does that get when you have to get 56, particularly if it's just going to be Republicans?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head. The fact is the majority of the work that's done here in Lansing is in a bipartisan manner. Unfortunately, that doesn't sell headlines like the controversial stuff does. However, I think we need to stop looking at bills and issues in terms of being Republican or Democrat. And we need to start looking at policies and thinking, how will this best move our state forward and enhance the quality of living in the state of Michigan for every single resident? And I think if we approach issues like that, whether we have 58 Republicans or 68 Republicans, we're going to work with the Democrats and we're going to work across the aisle because each person is sent here by roughly 90,000 people to serve their districts. And when they all do that and represent the values of people that sent them here, our state will grow. We've proven that over the past 8 years, and I intend to continue proving that over the next 2.
When you look ahead at the agenda that you would like to pursue, and again, that has a lot to do with what happens with the governor and the Senate, and of course in your prerogative, what would you like to start with, or what would you like to at least at some point during these next couple of years try to accomplish that would meet the goal that you just set out to be something that would be positive for everybody in the state?
You know, I think when you're looking at what we can continue to accomplish here in the state of Michigan and in the halls of Lansing to continue our economic comeback, I think there's several main things that continue to be roadblocks. And the fact is this: the high cost of car insurance, crumbling roads, or a lack of transparency in state government are not Republican and Democrat issues. The fact is the high cost of car insurance doesn't discriminate against Republicans over Democrats or vice versa. It's the fact that every single person is paying too much. And it's something that's really holding our economy back. I think we can come together and build relationships and build coalitions to ensure our roads and our infrastructure get the funding that they need. And it's no surprise that in 2018, the funding of roads was certainly highlighted along the campaign trail. And I will say this: many things were said and done on the campaign trail by Republicans and Democrats. But the fact is, the time for campaigning is over. It's now time to govern, and we need to put partisan differences aside and work for the best interests of the people. And there's many scenarios and many issues that we can tackle that will continue to move our state forward, and those are just several of them.
Well, let's start with the first one, and you talked about auto insurance. If I am a healthcare provider, I may not want scheduled fees to change. If I'm a trial attorney, I may not want to see benefits changed. If I am an insurance company, I don't want you to tell me what I can or can't charge. If I am a consumer, perhaps I don't want to lose my lifetime catastrophic care. Those are just four of the stakeholders that will have different views of what auto no-fault insurance might look like. We know how difficult that has been. I know there have been conversations, there are frameworks, but nothing gets across the finish line. So how do you change that?
Well, Rick, you just identified some of the key points of difference and debate when we're talking about how to lower the cost of car insurance. And first, let me say, whatever the conversation is, it will not be driven by the insurance industry, it will not be driven by the health industry, and it will not be driven by the trial attorneys. I think it needs to be driven by the people that we represent. And we need to ensure that they do have the opportunity to purchase a level of coverage that they think is in the best interest for themselves and for their family. And I think, Rick, when you look at the state of Michigan and you realize that many people in our state are paying more on a monthly basis for their car insurance over their car payment, it's ridiculous. And we can do much to improve the quality of living. It will ensure that people can afford to move back to Michigan and live here. And it will also ensure that more money is in every single person's pocket where they can now invest it into our economy. And we need a plan to reform our system that brings all stakeholders to the table, isn't driven by just one of them, but it's something where we really coalesce, we work across the aisle, and we get something done for the people of our state.
Do you see, and this is speculation, so I'm not trying to pin you down to a solution, but do you see a time, do you see even the conversation coming up that the state of Michigan does away with no fault and goes back to a tort system?
I think when you look at our current system and the high cost that people are paying, I think every option needs to be on the table. And the main question needs to be, what's in the best interest of the people that we serve? What's in the best interest of ensuring that people can afford to live in our state and they have great quality car insurance, affordable and available to them? And I think people need to have that choice. And I think, Rick, when people have the choice to choose what level of coverage that they seem would best fit the needs of their family, you're going to see costs lowered. And that needs to be the driving force of this entire conversation. And I truly believe all options need to be on the table and all stakeholders need to be at the table to ensure that we finally come up with something that works for our state.
All right, let's talk about roads. I've heard the number $3 billion thrown around. I know that over the course of time there has been more money put back into the roads, but we also know that roads have been neglected over a long period of time. Not just roads, infrastructure in general, but people think and talk about roads. So if a $3 billion number or a $1.5 billion number is a number that somebody suggests is what it's going to take for roads, how do you get there?
So there's obviously a lot of rhetoric when it comes to funding our roads, but one thing we can all agree on is that our roads need more funding. And it's difficult for us to brand ourselves as pure Michigan when our roads are crumbling the moment you cross the border. And I think that's unacceptable, and it's something that government needs to take very serious. I'd also like to highlight the fact, and this is often overlooked, Rick, that we actually in this last budget cycle appropriated the most funding ever in the history of our state to roads. But we need to do more, because this is not just a 5 or 10-year problem. This is an underinvestment in our roads over the past several decades, and we can do better. And unfortunately, too often when we're talking about the roads, we allow rhetoric to prevail, and we focus on the symptoms rather than the root problem. The symptom is that our roads are not getting enough funding. I don't care if you live in northern Michigan or southwest Michigan, southeast Michigan, or the Upper Peninsula. You think our roads need to be funded at a higher level. I think the root problem is this, and we will always have a road funding problem until this is addressed. The people of the state of Michigan are in the top bracket for what we pay at the pump. But we're at the bottom of the bracket compared to other states on what we dedicate to the roads from what we pay at the pump. And as long as we have 3 taxes that we pay at the pump and only 2 of them are going to roads, we will always have a road funding problem. The state of Michigan has talked about raising taxes in the past, we've talked about bonding in the past, and we've done those things. But we still have a road funding problem because we haven't gone to the root of the problem. And that's what we intend on doing, and I intend on working with my senator counterparts and Governor-elect Whitmer to ensure that we actually solve the problem moving forward and have sustainable resources going to our roads every single year.
I'm a reporter. When you say transparency, you get my attention pretty quickly because we all want to know more than what we are currently privy to. What needs to be done to make government more transparent and at the same time be able to protect certain privacy issues that deal with constituents, for example?
First, people need to understand that the state of Michigan, unfortunately, ranks at the very bottom of government transparency when compared to other states. And I think that's unacceptable. We need to be open and transparent and accountable to the people that send us here to represent them. And when you understand that the governor's office and the legislature is exempt from the Freedom of Information Act, yet we require the same thing for our local units of government, we have a double standard. And if transparency is good for locals, it should be good for state government as well. So I truly believe, and we led last year in this with the House. I was a lead sponsor with now Senator-elect Moss. This was a bipartisan bill package that took away the exemption of the Freedom of Information Act from the governor, as well as created a Legislative Open Records Act, because people need to have access to what we are doing for them and how we're spending our time on the taxpayer dollar. I think we can come a long way to restore people's trust in state government. It's not a partisan issue, and it never should be. But we intend on ensuring that we're more transparent and more accountable to the people that we serve.
There will be a number of new faces in Lansing and a number of familiar ones leaving. We'll talk with one of them next. To the Point. For the past 14 years, Dave Hildenbrand has been representing parts of Kent County in the House and now in the Senate. He is term limited and leaving Lansing, and we talked with him as he prepares to go. It seems impossible to me that you were working in the legislature very shortly after I started covering the legislature, and now you've served a full 14 years, 6 years in the House. You will have wrapped up 8 years in the Senate when we get to the end of the year. What has all of that experience been like? You've watched a lot of things happen. How long were you a staffer?
8 years in the staff, on staff for a couple different members of the legislature.
So 22 years you've been doing
22 years in the
this.
legislature.
You've seen a lot go on.
I have, and it's really bittersweet to see my tenure in the legislature come to an end. It's been, really an honor and a privilege to represent the greater Grand Rapids area and West Michigan in the legislature. And, some days they're very difficult, and I wonder, back in 2007 and 8 and 9 when this state was really struggling and we couldn't make decisions, we couldn't move the budget through the legislature and just make some tough decisions, some bold decisions to move the state forward. I remember driving back and forth wondering, what am I doing? I just felt like our wheels were spinning. It was almost embarrassing to be a part of it because the public was so frustrated about what was going on.
Remind people what that was like too, because there we were, and I say we because in covering the legislature, we would stay there. They would sometimes close the doors of the chamber so you couldn't leave to keep members inside the chamber. We as media could come and go, but theoretically you as members couldn't. You were in session, I think for one time, almost 70 hours trying to hold the board open for a vote that the leadership could never get. I mean, it really was a trying time to be there, and there was no money to be had. The state was broke. And there was no unanimity about what to do. I mean, that was tough.
It was very tough. I remember we would spend nights in the House chamber overnight, and I remember waking up one Sunday morning back in the caucus room off the House chamber, and I had to ask to leave in order to just go get some new clothes to wear because I was literally out of clothes spending the nights there. So it was very frustrating. You know, I just wondered what I was doing. Didn't feel like I was making any effort, any improvements to the state. But you know, in time, things changed and things got better. And then after I ran for the Senate and was elected to the Senate, then I worked under the leadership of Governor Snyder and leadership in the House and Senate, and I feel like we were able to really move the ball forward and begin to strengthen our state. And now we're in a position where we still have a lot of work to do, but I think we've stabilized things in Michigan. A lot of the numbers that you see about unemployment and income for folks and jobs that are available are all good signs for the future. So I worked hard and hope I'm leaving the state in a little better place than when I found it.
Well, when you look back and think about where the state was, and let's be clear, the economy was tanking across the country. We were kind of a leading indicator. Unfortunately, we got there a little sooner than maybe the rest of the country did. And so it's very difficult to try to pull together a budget and spending priorities while you're trying to help support people who need state support, while you're trying to fund things like education, because that's going to be important for the future, trying to do all of that when there aren't the resources there, and you have divided government. I mean, those were all factors that were working against the legislature and the governor's office, so it made it a whole lot more difficult. But when you look at, and I should point out, you've been the chairman of the appropriations over in the Senate for the past 4 years, so you've been really involved in budgeting. Can you talk a little bit about the difference in what it's like when you have money that you can spend, even though I know that spending always is an issue. You try not to spend everything, but there are always all those pressures. I mean, it's got to be easier to budget, but it's got to be harder because more people have more priorities when you've got money, right?
Yes. Well, one of the greatest things that we have in our Constitution is we have a responsibility to create a balanced budget. Unlike the federal government, who can borrow and spend more than the revenues they take in, we have that responsibility, which I think is great for any government. And I hope that someday we can get that as part of the federal government, federal system of government as well. But so we have that going into it. And yeah, it's all about setting priorities, and you know, I as part of the budget process, being very intricately involved as chair of the Senate Budget Committee, I would always go into it with as though it was like I was spending my own money. I wanted to be responsible and accountable with every tax dollar that we spent. And so we'd begin the process about identifying priorities. And for me, it was always, I had some basic priorities. Well, roads and infrastructure has been a priority for the last several years, and we were able to put over $1 billion of new money into our infrastructure and our road improvements. So over the next 2 or 3 years, there's going to be, you'll start to see, the people of Michigan will start to see significant improvements there. Education is always a priority, and it's more than just our K-12 public education system. We have great community colleges and universities out there. We've invested a ton in early childhood education, so our 4-year-olds, our preschoolers are ready and prepared for kindergarten when they turn 5 and enter the K-12 system. So that's been really a priority. And then third, the area I'll mention is public safety. We've done a lot to reform corrections. Our prison system is a huge piece of the state budget, spending over $2 billion. We have over 30 prisons and are responsible for over 40,000 prisoners in the state. That public safety piece in prisons and corrections is important, as well as our law enforcement and state police. We have been able to increase over the years the number of state troopers, because there's been a lot of retirees, retiring state troopers, and so they've been down a little bit. So it's good to see that effort, and that's been a priority to me, to really make sure that people feel safe in their communities and their state. So those are 3 key areas that have really been a priority for me as I've done work on the state budget.
One of the big things that happened shortly after Governor Snyder took over was he started readjusting the tax base and trying to move away from the MBT, which was the SBT, and move away from that. Included in that was taxing pensions for the first time in the state of Michigan, which still remains a sore point for folks impacted by that. But when you look at the taxation process in the state now, is it, from your perspective, more or less balanced, that everybody is more or less participating? Because it's always an argument about who should be taxed more or less.
Well, I'm a conservative, and so I'm always looking for opportunities to find ways to lower taxes on the hardworking people of Michigan. So I've gone 14 years ago when I came into the legislature, I talked to the people who voted for me. That's would be one of the priorities for me. So I'm always looking for opportunities. As the economy is stronger, more revenues come in, and that creates opportunities to lower tax rates for people. So there's been efforts to lower the income tax rate. Obviously, the sales tax rate is in the Constitution, but now we're collecting more and more sales tax revenue on internet sales. So we're seeing more and more revenue come in from sales tax. And of course, we have property taxes, which is a huge burden on people in Michigan. Now, they were lowered back in the 1990s through Proposal A, where you'll get your homestead exemption. But I'll always look for opportunities to lower property taxes for people so we can encourage people and incentivize people to live in their homes and be able to afford to live in their own homes.
It's not a fair question, but I'll ask it anyway. What is the biggest or most important thing that got done or didn't get done in your 14 years?
Well, for me, I really focused on making sure we support our veterans, our state veterans. And we have 2 veterans homes in Michigan. And I remember 14 years ago when I first got elected, I visited the home here in Grand Rapids, and I could not believe my eyes the way we were treating our veterans. And most of these were World War II veterans at the time. And it was basically a large room with 3 little tiny beds that looked like cots, and they each had 1 dresser, and there was very little privacy. And it looked so institutionalized. And I knew that day when I went to that home that I was going to do everything I can to try and create a better environment for our state's veterans. And so it took many years to do, but fortunately we created a new oversight structure for the veterans homes in Michigan. And I was able to partner with a few people to secure the funding to create a new home, veterans home in Grand Rapids, and then an additional home in Southeast Michigan. And the goal is to really deliver the health care, and these are long-term care facilities, so they're assisted care and skilled nursing facilities that really will deliver the health care that our veterans deserve.
There's another component to that, and as you would expect, because of the size of the population in Southeast Michigan, many of the veterans at the Veterans Home here in Grand Rapids don't have any family here. Their family is from Southeast Michigan. So the new home there will help house those people and keep them closer to their families. And then going forward, even after your tenure, there's the possibility for other homes around the state.
You bet. The framework we built was to start with these 2 new homes, the Southeast Michigan one and then a new home in Grand Rapids. There will be the existing home in the Upper Peninsula in Marquette. But the framework we laid out is once these are done, these homes are built and occupied and they're successful, there's plans where we can add additional homes throughout the state in a lot of our population areas.
So this is the final question in what may be, at least for now, our final interview after many over all of these years. As an observer, I look at term limits and see pluses and minuses. You are the ultimate example of term limits. You served all the years you could in the House, all the years you could in the Senate, and now with that 14 years of experience, you are, whether you want to or not, leaving office. Are term limits serving this state well?
I think term limits I support term limits. I guess in Michigan, I would say that our term limits are too restrictive. I would support because I do think some turnover is good. Unfortunately, in Michigan, I think we have too much turnover in the legislature. I would support a reform to our term limit proposal that would extend it to maybe 20 years or 24 years, but allow people to serve all that time in one chamber or the other. So basically, say if it's 24-year term limit, you could have somebody in the House for 24 years and then be term limited. You could have somebody in the Senate for 24 years or term limited, or they could go back and forth. So you'll get some institutional knowledge, some experience still there, but then you'll have a little bit of the turnover to get fresh people with new ideas that really reflect the ever-changing times that we have in Michigan.
Over the next few weeks, we hope to talk to any number of senators who are leaving Lansing as we continue to cover what's going on there now and after the first of the year. Be right back to the point. Lame duck session continues in Lansing. Expect more action on minimum wage and paid sick leave. We could see more action on line 5 too. And there are other issues that could come up, but the governor's going to have to get some priorities too. We'll be following that and see you next week. To the point.